Imagine you're a noble courtier in medieval France, and you've just been invited to dine with the king himself. You've spent months preparing for this moment. Your finest silk doublet, your most expensive perfume, your hair perfectly coiffed. But as you approach the royal table, something hits you like a physical blow. The stench. It's not just unpleasant, it's overwhelming, nauseating, almost visible in its intensity. The most powerful man in Europe, the divine representative of God on earth, smells like he hasn't bathed in months. Because he hasn't. You watch in horrified fascination as His Majesty picks at his food with fingers black with grime, his fingernails so long and filthy they could be mistaken for claws. When he speaks, his breath carries the putrid scent of rotting teeth and decaying gums. The other nobles around you seem unfazed, as if this grotesque display of royal uncleanliness is perfectly normal. And that's when you realize the horrifying truth. It is normal. This is what passes for hygiene among the most privileged people in medieval Europe. You're witnessing the result of some of the most bizarre, backward, and downright dangerous hygiene laws ever conceived by human minds. Laws that turned cleanliness from a virtue into a sin, that made bathing illegal, and that created aristocratic culture so filthy it would make a modern sewage worker retch. These weren't just quirky customs or harmless traditions. They were systematic policies that condemned entire populations to lives of disease, suffering, and early death. Before diving into these forgotten stories of medieval madness, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. What you're about to discover isn't just another tale of medieval ignorance, it's the story of how religious extremism, political paranoia, and sheer human stupidity combined to create hygiene laws so absurd they defied basic human decency. These regulations didn't just affect peasants or commoners. They were enforced most strictly among royalty and nobility, the very people who had the resources to maintain proper cleanliness, but were forbidden from doing so by their own twisted logic. The roots of medieval Europe's war against cleanliness began in the early Christian church's obsession with spiritual purity over physical cleanliness. Church fathers like St. Jerome declared that he who has bathed in Christ need not bathe again, establishing the foundation for centuries of institutionalized filth. But it was the rise of powerful monarchies that transformed these religious suggestions into legally enforceable mandates that would shape European society for nearly 1,000 years. Picture the court of King Louis IX of France in the 13th century, a man so pious he was later canonized as Saint Louis. His palace at Vincennes was considered the pinnacle of medieval sophistication, yet it operated under hygiene laws that would horrify modern sensibilities. The king himself was required by both religious doctrine and royal protocol to bathe no more than twice per year, and even then only for specific ceremonial purposes. Court physicians, operating under the medical theories inherited from ancient texts, believed that frequent bathing opened the pores and allowed evil humors to enter the body, causing disease and moral corruption. But the prohibition against bathing was just the beginning. Royal hygiene laws extended to every aspect of personal cleanliness, creating a comprehensive system of mandated filth that affected everything from dental care to clothing. Teeth cleaning was considered vanity and therefore sinful, leading to royal smiles that resembled graveyards of black and rotting stumps. Hair washing was forbidden except during specific religious festivals, resulting in scalps so infested with lice and parasites that courtiers developed elaborate headdresses designed not for beauty but to contain the constant scratching and bleeding. The enforcement of these laws created a bizarre hierarchy of filthiness within royal courts. The closer you were to the king, the stricter the hygiene restrictions became. Royal family members were subject to the most severe limitations, while lesser nobles had slightly more freedom in their personal cleanliness habits. Court officials monitored compliance with these regulations, and violations could result in fines, imprisonment, or even banishment from court society. Consider the daily routine of Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women in medieval Europe. As Queen of France and later Queen of England, she ruled over vast territories and commanded armies. Yet she was forbidden by law from bathing more than once every 3 months. Her morning routine, documented by court chroniclers, began with servants scraping away the accumulated grime from her skin using metal instruments, since soap was considered a luxury item that weakened moral character. Her hair, unwashed for months at a time, was coated in animal fats and powders to mask the stench and provide some protection against the legions of parasites that called her scalp home. The medical justifications for these hygiene laws were elaborate and completely wrong. Court physicians trained in universities that taught ancient Greek and Roman medical theories believed that the human body contained four essential humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Maintaining health required keeping these humors in perfect balance, and bathing was thought to disrupt this delicate equilibrium. Water, particularly warm water, was believed to open the pores and allow evil spirits to enter the body, causing everything from plague to madness to moral corruption. These medical theories were supported by religious doctrine that viewed the body as inherently sinful and physical pleasure as spiritually dangerous. Bathing, with its associated feelings of cleanliness and comfort, was seen as a form of self-indulgence that distracted from proper focus on spiritual matters. The combination of medical authority and religious sanction made these hygiene laws virtually unquestionable within medieval society. The consequences of these policies were catastrophic. Royal courts became breeding grounds for diseases that should have been easily preventable through basic hygiene. Skin conditions were so common among nobility that they were considered normal parts of aristocratic life. Scabies, ringworm, and various fungal infections created a constantly itching, scratching population of rulers whose primary concern wasn't governing their kingdoms, but finding relief from their own diseased flesh. The stench within royal palaces was legendary. Visitors from other cultures, particularly those from the Islamic world or Byzantine Empire where bathing remained common, left detailed accounts of their shock at the smell of European courts. One Islamic diplomat visiting the court of Charlemagne wrote, "The Frankish nobles smell like corpses left in the sun for days. Their women perfume themselves with oils so strong they burn the eyes, yet still cannot mask the underlying rot of their unwashed bodies." But perhaps most disturbing was how these hygiene laws affected the most intimate aspects of royal life. Marriage ceremonies included specific provisions about the cleanliness levels expected of bride and groom, with too much cleanliness being grounds for annulment on charges of vanity or spiritual corruption. Wedding nights were conducted between partners who might not have bathed in months, creating intimate encounters that were as much endurance tests as expressions of love. The clothing regulations that accompanied these hygiene laws created additional layers of misery. Garments were expected to be worn for months without washing, as frequent laundering was seen as wasteful and potentially spiritually corrupting. The wealthy developed elaborate systems of layering clothes to absorb bodily fluids and odors, creating walking textile museums that grew more disgusting with each passing day. Undergarments, when they existed at all, were changed infrequently and often shared between family members to avoid the sin of excessive clothing ownership. Royal children grew up within this system of institutionalized filth, learning from their earliest years that cleanliness was associated with sin and moral weakness. Their education included detailed instruction in the proper levels of acceptable dirtiness for their social rank, with princes and princesses competing not for who was cleanest, but for who could endure the greatest levels of filth while maintaining their dignity and authority. The economic implications of these hygiene laws were staggering. Entire industries that might have developed around soap making, perfume creation, and clothing care were stunted or prevented entirely. The few craftspeople who did work in these areas operated under strict regulations that limited their products to the bare minimum needed for ceremonial purposes. Innovation in cleaning technologies was actively discouraged, as it might lead to excessive cleanliness among the population. Yet even within this system of mandated filthiness, there were hierarchies and exceptions that revealed the arbitrary nature of these laws. Certain religious festivals permitted temporary relaxation of hygiene restrictions, leading to bizarre spectacles where entire royal courts would rush to public bathhouses for their once or twice yearly sanctioned cleaning. These events became major social occasions, with elaborate protocols governing who could bathe, when, in what order, and using which specific cleaning materials. The psychological impact on individuals living under these laws was profound and lasting. Many nobles developed what we might now recognize as severe anxiety disorders related to their own bodily functions and cleanliness needs. Court records contain numerous accounts of aristocrats suffering nervous breakdowns triggered by their inability to maintain basic personal hygiene while conforming to social expectations. The enforcement mechanisms for these hygiene laws were as elaborate as they were cruel. Court officials known as cleanliness monitors made regular inspections of noble households, checking for evidence of unauthorized bathing or excessive attention to personal grooming. These inspectors had the authority to impose fines, confiscate cleaning materials, and even recommend imprisonment for serious violations of hygiene regulations. But resistance to these laws did exist, though it had to be carefully hidden from authorities. Secret bathing societies developed among some noble families who would gather in remote locations for clandestine washing rituals that violated every principle of medieval hygiene law. These underground networks operated with the secrecy and paranoia of political conspiracies, because discovery could mean social ruin and legal punishment. The international implications of European hygiene laws became apparent when diplomatic missions traveled between kingdoms with different cleanliness standards. Ambassadors had to be specially prepared for visits to courts with stricter hygiene laws, sometimes going months without bathing before their missions to avoid giving offense through excessive cleanliness. Trade relationships were also affected, as merchants from cultures that practiced regular bathing found themselves excluded from certain European markets because their cleanliness was seen as evidence of moral corruption or foreign influence. The economic isolation that resulted from these policies contributed to Europe's relative backwardness compared to other contemporary civilizations. The medical consequences of these laws extended far beyond individual discomfort. Entire royal bloodlines suffered from preventable diseases that could have been avoided through basic hygiene. Infant mortality rates among nobility were catastrophically high, partly due to the filthy conditions in which even royal babies were raised. The genetic lines of Europe's most powerful families were literally being poisoned by their own hygiene laws. Women bore the brunt of these regulations in particularly cruel ways. Menstrual hygiene became a nightmare of improvised solutions and constant discomfort, as proper cleaning materials and methods were forbidden. Childbirth, already dangerous in medieval times, became even more perilous when conducted in deliberately unsanitary conditions that increased the risk of infection and death for both mothers and babies. The religious justification for these horrific conditions reached its peak during the reign of King Philip Augustus of France, who issued the infamous Decree of Sacred Filth in 1180. This royal edict declared that excessive cleanliness was not merely spiritually dangerous, but constituted actual heresy, punishable by excommunication or death. The decree established detailed guidelines for acceptable levels of dirt accumulation on different parts of the body, with measurements taken using special instruments designed to gauge the thickness of grime layers on royal skin. Under these laws, courtiers were required to maintain specific dirt patterns that indicated their rank and religious devotion. Higher nobles were expected to have thicker layers of accumulated filth, while lower-ranking individuals could maintain slightly cleaner appearances as befitted their lesser spiritual status. The king himself was required to achieve what court documents called divine putrefaction, a state of uncleanliness so profound it was believed to bring him closer to God through the mortification of his physical form. Court artists of this period developed entirely new techniques for portrait painting that could capture the nobility's mandated filthiness while still maintaining some semblance of royal dignity. These paintings, when they survive today, show figures whose skin appears mottled and discolored, whose hair hangs in greasy ropes, and whose clothing bears visible stains that were considered marks of spiritual achievement rather than personal negligence. The enforcement of these hygiene laws created an entire bureaucracy of filth inspection. Royal cleanliness commissioners held positions of enormous power within medieval courts, conducting surprise inspections of noble households to ensure compliance with dirt regulations. These officials carried elaborate measuring devices to assess grime thickness, portable scales to weigh accumulated bodily secretions, and detailed charts showing acceptable parasite populations for different social ranks. The inspection process itself was a grotesque ritual that could take hours to complete. Commissioners would examine every inch of a noble's body, documenting dirt patterns, measuring nail length and filth content, counting lice and flea populations, and testing the potency of bodily odors against standardized smell samples. Those who passed inspection received certificates of proper uncleanliness that had to be displayed prominently in their homes. Those who failed faced immediate penalties ranging from public humiliation to property confiscation. But the true horror of these laws became apparent in their application to royal marriages and reproduction. Brides were required to demonstrate their spiritual worthiness through documented periods of intensive filth accumulation before wedding ceremonies. Marriage contracts included specific clauses about minimum dirt requirements and maximum allowable cleanliness levels for both partners. Some noble families spent months preparing their daughters for marriage by systematically preventing any form of washing or grooming that might disqualify them from royal consideration. The wedding ceremonies themselves became endurance tests where guests competed to see who could tolerate the overwhelming stench of the unwashed bride and groom. Court musicians developed special breathing techniques to perform without fainting from the odors, while wedding feast preparations had to account for the fact that many guests would be too nauseous from the smell to eat properly. Royal physicians during this period created elaborate medical theories to justify the catastrophic health effects of these hygiene laws. When nobles died from preventable diseases clearly linked to poor sanitation, court doctors blamed spiritual failings rather than physical uncleanliness. They developed complex diagnostic procedures that interpreted skin diseases, dental decay, and parasite infestations as signs of moral progress rather than health problems. The pharmaceutical industry of medieval Europe adapted to these conditions by focusing entirely on masking odors and treating symptoms rather than addressing root causes. Perfume makers created increasingly powerful scents, designed not to enhance natural cleanliness, but to cover the stench of deliberately maintained filth. These perfumes were so strong they often caused headaches, nausea, and respiratory problems in addition to their intended masking effects. Clothing designers developed specialized garments that could contain and channel bodily fluids, while preventing them from causing too much visible damage to outer clothing. These undergarments, made from materials designed to absorb and retain moisture and odors, became breeding grounds for bacteria and parasites that created their own additional health problems. The architectural implications of these hygiene laws shaped the design of medieval palaces and castles in disturbing ways. Buildings were constructed with minimal ventilation to prevent the loss of accumulated odors that were considered spiritually beneficial. Private chambers were designed to trap and concentrate smells rather than disperse them. Even royal gardens were planted with flowers chosen not for their beauty, but for their ability to add to rather than mask the prevailing atmosphere of controlled decay. The international diplomatic consequences of European hygiene laws became increasingly problematic as trade and political relationships expanded. Ambassadors from the Islamic world, where bathing and cleanliness remained normal practices, found European courts almost impossible to endure. Some diplomatic missions failed entirely because foreign representatives could not physically tolerate the conditions in European palaces long enough to conduct negotiations. These cultural clashes led to the development of specialized diplomatic protocols for dealing with hygiene differences between kingdoms. Some European courts created separate quarters for foreign visitors, where different cleanliness standards might be temporarily tolerated, while others required visiting diplomats to undergo ceremonial filth applications before being permitted to enter royal presence. The economic cost of maintaining these hygiene laws was enormous, but hidden within the medieval accounting systems. Resources that might have been used for soap production, water infrastructure, or textile cleaning were instead devoted to perfume manufacturing, odor containment systems, and medical treatments for hygiene-related diseases. The true economic impact only became apparent centuries later when historians calculated the productivity losses and healthcare costs associated with these policies. Children born into royal families during this period faced a childhood that was literally toxic. From birth, they were exposed to levels of bacteria, parasites, and chemical contamination that would be considered child abuse by any modern standard. Their development was stunted not just by malnutrition and disease, but by the constant stress of living in deliberately unsanitary conditions that their own parents maintained through legal mandate. The educational system for noble children included detailed instruction in proper filth maintenance techniques. Young princes and princesses learned how to cultivate specific types of skin conditions, how to encourage lice populations to flourish in their hair, and how to achieve the optimal balance of bodily odors that would mark them as properly religious and socially acceptable members of the aristocracy. The psychological damage inflicted by these systems extended far beyond individual discomfort. Entire generations of European nobility developed profound anxieties about cleanliness that persisted even when hygiene laws began to change. Many nobles who lived through these periods never fully recovered their ability to maintain normal personal hygiene, even when it became socially acceptable to do so. The documentation of these hygiene laws provides a window into a world so alien to modern sensibilities that it challenges our understanding of human adaptability. Court records describe daily routines that sound more like torture than normal life, social customs that prioritize suffering over comfort, and legal systems that punished basic human decency while rewarding deliberate self-destruction. Yet within this system of institutionalized filth, some individuals found ways to maintain their humanity and dignity despite the overwhelming pressure to conform to standards of deliberate uncleanliness. Their stories, buried in private correspondence and secret diaries, reveal the true human cost of laws that treated basic hygiene as a criminal offense worthy of the most severe punishment. The resistance movements that developed in response to these hygiene laws represent some of the most dangerous and secretive activities in medieval Europe. Noble families who dared to maintain basic cleanliness had to operate with the same level of secrecy as political revolutionaries because discovery meant not just social disgrace, but potential execution for heresy against divine filth mandates. These underground cleanliness networks developed elaborate codes and signals to communicate with fellow conspirators. A white handkerchief worn in a specific manner might indicate a safe house where secret bathing could occur. Certain phrases embedded in casual conversation could identify fellow resistance members. Even the arrangement of flowers in a garden might convey information about upcoming clandestine washing gatherings. The safe houses themselves were marvels of engineering designed to avoid detection. Hidden chambers were constructed behind false walls, accessible only through concealed passages that could be sealed quickly if hygiene inspectors arrived unexpectedly. These rooms contained carefully maintained supplies of soap, clean water, and washing implements that had to be smuggled in piece by piece over months or years. The soap used in these operations was often more valuable than gold, not because of its material cost, but because of the extreme risk involved in obtaining it. Soap makers who supplied the resistance operated under constant threat of imprisonment or death. Their workshops were disguised as other businesses, and their products were transported using the same methods employed by smugglers of contraband weapons or forbidden books. Water for secret bathing presented its own challenges. Large quantities of clean water brought to noble households would immediately arouse suspicion from cleanliness monitors. Resistance members had to develop ingenious methods for accumulating water slowly over time, hiding it in containers designed to look like wine barrels or grain storage vessels. The actual bathing rituals conducted by these resistance groups took on an almost religious significance. Participants described the experience of washing away months of accumulated filth as a spiritual rebirth that was worth any risk. These ceremonies were conducted in complete silence to avoid detection, with lookouts posted to warn of approaching authorities. But perhaps the most dangerous aspect of the resistance was the psychological transformation it created. Once nobles experienced the relief and health benefits of basic cleanliness, returning to the mandated filth became almost unbearable. This created a terrible dilemma. Continue the dangerous illegal activity, or return to a life of deliberately maintained disease and discomfort? Many resistance members developed elaborate techniques for maintaining the appearance of proper filthiness, while secretly staying as clean as possible. They would apply artificial dirt and controlled amounts of specific odors to fool hygiene inspectors while keeping their actual skin and hair as healthy as circumstances allowed. These deception techniques required constant vigilance and extraordinary attention to detail. The discovery of resistance networks led to some of the most brutal punishments in medieval legal history. Entire noble families were stripped of their titles and properties. Some were subjected to public humiliation rituals where they were forced to wallow in actual sewage while crowds mocked their attempts at cleanliness. Others faced execution by methods specifically designed to reflect their crimes against divine filth. The Church's response to cleanliness resistance was particularly vicious. Special inquisitions were established to root out what religious authorities called the heresy of cleanliness. These tribunals had unlimited power to investigate, torture, and execute anyone suspected of maintaining unauthorized hygiene practices. The testimony extracted under torture led to accusations that spread like wildfire through noble society, creating an atmosphere of paranoia and mutual suspicion. Families were torn apart by these investigations. Children were encouraged to inform on parents who might be secretly bathing. Spouses were rewarded for reporting their partner's hygiene violations. The social fabric of medieval nobility was shredded by laws that turned basic human decency into grounds for betrayal and execution. The international implications of Europe's hygiene laws created diplomatic crises that lasted for generations. When Princess Isabella of France was married to Edward II of England, the negotiation process included detailed discussions about acceptable filth levels for the royal couple. Isabella's French upbringing had exposed her to slightly more relaxed hygiene standards than those enforced in England, creating a potential international incident. The wedding preparations required months of intensive filth accumulation for Isabella to meet English cleanliness standards. French court physicians had to consult with their English counterparts to ensure the princess achieved the proper level of royal uncleanliness without risking her health so severely that she might die before producing an heir. Trade relationships suffered as merchants from different kingdoms had to navigate varying hygiene laws. A trader who was acceptably filthy by French standards might be considered dangerously clean by German regulations, while Spanish requirements could make products from cleaner kingdoms unmarketable due to their association with spiritual corruption. The military implications of these laws were catastrophic, but rarely acknowledged by medieval commanders. Armies composed of deliberately unwashed soldiers suffered disease rates that often exceeded battlefield casualties. Entire military campaigns failed not because of enemy action, but because troops became too sick to fight, due to the hygiene conditions mandated by military regulations. Castle sieges took on new dimensions, when both attackers and defenders were weakened by diseases that could have been prevented through basic sanitation. The famous Siege of Calais in 1347 lasted over a year, partly because both English and French forces were decimated by hygiene-related illnesses that made effective military action nearly impossible. The development of armor and military equipment had to account for the fact that soldiers would never wash. Metal components were designed to contain and channel bodily fluids rather than provide optimal protection. Padding and cloth elements were expected to become saturated with various secretions, and were often replaced not because of combat damage, but because they had literally rotted away from prolonged exposure to unwashed bodies. Naval expeditions faced even greater challenges. Ships at sea for months with crews who never bathed became floating disease laboratories where new forms of illness evolved and spread. The mortality rates on medieval naval voyages often exceeded 50%, with most deaths attributed to diseases that were directly linked to the mandated filth conditions maintained aboard ship. The technological development of medieval Europe was severely hampered by hygiene laws that made certain types of innovation impossible. Industries that might have emerged around water purification, soap manufacturing, or textile cleaning never developed because the market for such products was legally prohibited. Medical advancement stagnated as physicians were required to treat hygiene-related diseases without addressing their obvious causes. Doctors developed increasingly elaborate theories to explain epidemics and health problems, while being forbidden to recommend the simple cleanliness measures that would have prevented most illnesses. The printing industry, when it finally emerged, had to accommodate the fact that books would be handled by readers whose hands were deliberately kept filthy. Special inks and papers were developed to resist the corrosive effects of the acids and oils that accumulated on unwashed human skin. Libraries became repositories not just of knowledge, but of every disease that could be transmitted through contaminated surfaces. Educational institutions faced unique challenges in maintaining hygiene laws while attempting to create environments where learning could occur. Universities developed elaborate seating arrangements designed to minimize the health impact of having large numbers of unwashed students in enclosed spaces. Special ventilation systems were created not to provide fresh air but to circulate the accumulated odors in patterns that would cause the least disruption to academic activities. The social hierarchy of medieval Europe was literally written on people's bodies through the varying levels of mandated filth required for different social ranks. A peasant who was too clean might be suspected of harboring aristocratic pretensions, while a noble who was insufficiently dirty could be accused of spiritual pride or foreign influence. Marriage negotiations within this system required detailed documentation of each party's hygiene status. Potential brides and grooms were evaluated not just for their wealth and political connections, but for their ability to maintain appropriate levels of filth throughout their lives. Marriage contracts included specific clauses about hygiene obligations and penalties for violations of cleanliness standards. The legal system itself became contaminated by hygiene laws that made normal judicial procedures almost impossible to conduct. Court sessions had to be abbreviated because judges, lawyers, and witnesses could not tolerate extended exposure to the concentrated odors of crowded courtrooms. Legal documents had to be written on materials that could survive handling by deliberately unwashed hands. Property law became complicated by hygiene requirements that affected the value and usability of real estate. Houses and castles were evaluated not just for their strategic or economic value, but for their ability to contain and concentrate the odors required by law. Buildings that were too well ventilated or easy to clean could actually decrease in value because they made it difficult for residents to maintain proper filth levels. The inheritance system had to account for hygiene-related considerations that could affect the transfer of titles and properties. Heirs who showed excessive interest in cleanliness might be deemed unfit to inherit, while those who demonstrated proper commitment to royal filth could be favored regardless of their other qualifications. Banking and commerce were disrupted by hygiene laws that made normal business relationships almost impossible to maintain. Contracts had to be negotiated and signed by parties who could barely tolerate being in the same room together. Coins and other forms of currency became vectors for disease transmission as they passed between unwashed hands throughout the medieval economy. The artistic and cultural development of medieval Europe reflected the dominance of hygiene laws in ways that are still visible in surviving works. Portraits from this period show figures whose clothing, hair, and skin display the effects of mandated uncleanliness. Sculptors developed techniques for representing the texture and appearance of deliberately maintained filth in ways that would be considered beautiful rather than repulsive. Literary works of the period contain elaborate descriptions of characters whose spiritual worth was measured by their commitment to physical uncleanliness. Heroes in medieval romances were often distinguished not by their cleanliness and grooming, but by their ability to maintain dignity while adhering to the highest standards of royal filth. Musical compositions had to account for the fact that performers and audiences would be gathered in spaces filled with the concentrated odors of unwashed bodies. Instruments were designed to function despite the corrosive effects of acids and oils from constantly dirty hands. Performance spaces were arranged to minimize the health risks associated with having large groups of deliberately unwashed people in enclosed areas. The religious art of this period reflects the theological justifications for hygiene laws in ways that modern viewers often misinterpret. Saints are depicted with skin conditions and unkempt appearance that were meant to represent spiritual achievement rather than physical neglect. Religious ceremonies incorporated the odors and visual effects of mandated uncleanliness as integral parts of worship that brought participants closer to divine truth. Architectural development was fundamentally shaped by the need to accommodate populations that never bathed. Churches, palaces, and public buildings were designed with minimal ventilation to preserve the spiritually beneficial effects of concentrated human odors. Construction techniques had to account for the fact that buildings would be constantly exposed to the corrosive effects of unwashed occupants. The urban planning of medieval cities reflects the influence of hygiene laws that made normal sanitation impossible. Streets were designed to channel waste and runoff in ways that would contribute to rather than diminish the overall atmosphere of controlled decay that was considered spiritually beneficial. Public spaces were arranged to maximize rather than minimize the concentration of odors from unwashed populations. The agricultural systems of medieval Europe had to adapt to hygiene laws that made normal food handling impossible. Farmers, millers, and bakers were required to maintain specific levels of hand contamination that inevitably transferred to food products. Bread, cheese, and other staples carried the bacterial signatures of their deliberately unwashed producers, creating a food supply that was systematically contaminated at every stage of production. Cooking techniques evolved to accommodate the reality that food would be prepared and served by people whose hands were legally required to be filthy. Recipes from this period include instructions for masking the taste of contamination, while preserving the spiritual benefits of consuming food that had been handled according to divine filth requirements. Spices became valuable not just for flavor, but for their ability to make contaminated food palatable. The storage and preservation of food presented unique challenges when hygiene laws prevented proper cleaning of containers and storage areas. Granaries, wine cellars, and food pantries became breeding grounds for bacteria and pests that were actually encouraged as signs of proper spiritual management. Food spoilage was often interpreted as evidence of divine blessing rather than poor sanitation. Market systems developed elaborate protocols for buying and selling food that had been deliberately contaminated according to legal requirements. Merchants had to demonstrate that their products met minimum filth standards while still being safe enough to consume. This led to the development of specialized testing procedures that evaluated the spiritual quality of contamination levels in various food items. The dining customs of medieval nobility reflected the hierarchical nature of hygiene laws through elaborate rituals that celebrated rather than concealed the effects of mandated uncleanliness. Royal banquets became theatrical displays where the accumulated filth of participants was as much a part of the entertainment as the food itself. Guests competed to demonstrate their spiritual worthiness through visible evidence of their commitment to divine dirt requirements. Table manners evolved to accommodate the reality that diners would be handling food with deliberately contaminated hands. Utensils were designed not to maintain cleanliness, but to channel and distribute the beneficial contamination from unwashed hands to food items. Serving procedures were arranged to maximize rather than minimize the transfer of spiritually significant filth from servers to meals. The development of pottery and metalwork reflected the need to create vessels that could function despite constant exposure to deliberately maintained contamination. Glazes and finishes were formulated to interact beneficially with the acids and oils from unwashed hands rather than resist them. Drinking cups and serving bowls were designed to retain and concentrate odors rather than eliminate them. Wine and ale production adapted to hygiene laws that made normal brewing impossible. Fermentation processes were modified to account for the bacterial contributions of unwashed workers, whose contamination was considered essential to proper spiritual brewing. The resulting beverages carried flavors and properties that reflected the mandated uncleanliness of their production methods. The textile industry faced perhaps the greatest challenges from hygiene laws that made normal fabric care impossible. Clothing was expected to retain the beneficial contamination of its wearers throughout its useful life. Washing techniques were limited to ceremonial occasions and had to preserve rather than remove the accumulated spiritual benefits of extended wear by unwashed bodies. Dyeing and fabric finishing processes had to account for the fact that clothing would immediately become contaminated with legally mandated filth. Colors and treatments were developed to mask or complement the effects of prolonged exposure to unwashed human bodies, rather than maintain their original appearance. The resulting textiles carried permanent odor signatures that marked their owner's social rank and spiritual commitment. Tailoring techniques evolved to create garments that could accommodate and contain the effects of mandated uncleanliness, while still maintaining some semblance of royal dignity. Hidden pockets and absorbent layers were incorporated into noble clothing to manage bodily secretions without violating the prohibition against excessive cleanliness. Seam construction had to account for the stress of constant moisture and contamination. The leather industry adapted to produce materials that could function despite constant exposure to the corrosive effects of unwashed human contact. Tanning processes were modified to create leather goods that would actually improve with contamination rather than deteriorate. Shoes, belts, and other accessories were designed to absorb and retain the beneficial effects of prolonged contact with ritually unclean bodies. Jewelry and metalwork faced unique challenges from hygiene laws that made normal maintenance impossible. Precious metals and gems were expected to develop patinas and surface treatments that reflected their owner's spiritual commitment to divine filth. Cleaning techniques were limited to specific ceremonial occasions and had to preserve the accumulated spiritual benefits of extended wear by unwashed nobility. The timekeeping systems of medieval Europe had to accommodate the reality that clocks and other instruments would be handled by deliberately contaminated hands. Mechanical devices were designed to function despite the corrosive effects of acids and oils from unwashed operators. Maintenance procedures had to work around hygiene laws that made normal cleaning impossible. Transportation systems reflected the dominance of hygiene laws in ways that affected everything from road construction to vehicle design. Carriages and litters had to contain and channel the concentrated odors of their unwashed passengers while still providing adequate ventilation to prevent suffocation. Roads were designed to minimize dust that might accidentally clean travelers rather than maximize their spiritual contamination. The postal system adapted to handle correspondence that would inevitably become contaminated with the legally mandated filth of its handlers. Paper and ink were formulated to survive contact with deliberately unwashed hands while preserving the spiritual benefits of such contamination. Sealing techniques had to account for the corrosive effects of acids and oils from ritually unclean fingers. The banking industry developed specialized procedures for handling currency that would be constantly contaminated by unwashed hands. Coins were designed to develop beneficial patinas from contact with legally mandated filth. Storage and transport systems had to preserve rather than eliminate the spiritual contamination that accumulated on monetary instruments. Record-keeping systems had to accommodate the reality that documents would be handled by deliberately unwashed scribes and officials. Writing materials were formulated to interact beneficially with contamination rather than resist it. Archive storage methods were designed to preserve the accumulated spiritual benefits of handling by ritually unclean administrators. The legal implications of these hygiene laws extended far beyond their original religious and social justifications. Entire branches of jurisprudence developed around the interpretation and enforcement of cleanliness regulations. Courts of hygiene inspection held power equal to or greater than traditional criminal courts, with the authority to impose punishments ranging from fines to execution for violations of divine filth requirements. The international diplomatic consequences of European hygiene laws created lasting tensions that influenced political relationships for centuries. Treaties and trade agreements had to include specific provisions for accommodating different cleanliness standards between kingdoms. Some diplomatic relationships never recovered from the cultural shock of encountering radically different approaches to basic human hygiene. The military effectiveness of medieval European armies was severely compromised by hygiene laws that made normal camp sanitation impossible. Disease rates in military camps often exceeded battle casualties by factors of 10 or more. The tactical advantages that might have been gained through superior equipment or training were regularly negated by the physical debilitation caused by mandated uncleanliness. The technological development of medieval Europe lagged behind other contemporary civilizations, partly due to hygiene laws that made certain types of innovation impossible. Industries that might have emerged around water management, textile care, or medical treatment never developed because the markets for such products were legally prohibited. The educational systems of medieval Europe struggled to function under hygiene laws that made normal classroom environments almost unbearable. Students and teachers who were required to maintain specific levels of contamination created learning environments that were hostile to intellectual development. The concentration of deliberately unwashed individuals in enclosed spaces made extended study sessions physically impossible. The decline of these bizarre hygiene laws came not through sudden enlightenment, but through the gradual recognition that they were literally killing the people they were supposed to protect. The Black Death of the 14th century devastated European populations that had been weakened by centuries of mandated uncleanliness. The kingdoms that survived were often those that had begun quietly relaxing their hygiene requirements. The Renaissance brought new ideas about human dignity and bodily care that slowly undermined the religious and political justifications for institutionalized filth. Artists and scholars who had contact with classical texts began questioning whether divine will really required such systematic self-destruction. Medical knowledge imported from Islamic and Byzantine sources provided alternative theories that didn't equate cleanliness with spiritual corruption. But the psychological and cultural damage inflicted by centuries of hygiene laws persisted long after the formal regulations were abandoned. Generations of Europeans had been conditioned to associate cleanliness with sin and contamination with virtue. The process of relearning normal human hygiene took centuries and was never fully completed in some regions. The legacy of medieval hygiene laws can still be traced in European attitudes toward bathing, personal cleanliness, and bodily functions. Cultural anxieties about excessive cleanliness, suspicion of perfumes and cosmetics, and discomfort with public bathing facilities all reflect the lasting impact of laws that once made cleanliness a capital crime. The historical record of these regulations provides a sobering reminder of how religious extremism and political authority can combine to create systems that deny basic human dignity in the name of higher purposes. The nobles who enforced these laws believed they were protecting their subjects from spiritual contamination, while actually condemning them to lives of preventable suffering and early death. Perhaps most tragically, the people who suffered under these laws often internalized the justifications for their own misery. Generations of Europeans learned to view their deliberate uncleanliness as a mark of spiritual achievement rather than systematic abuse. They competed to demonstrate their commitment to divine filth requirements while their bodies and minds were destroyed by the very practices they celebrated. The bizarre hygiene laws of medieval royalty represent one of history's most comprehensive examples of how human societies can convince themselves that suffering is virtue and cruelty is kindness. These weren't just strange customs or harmless traditions. They were systematic policies that caused immeasurable human suffering, while serving no purpose beyond the maintenance of political and religious control over populations that had been taught to accept their own degradation as divine will. Today, as we face our own challenges with misinformation, authoritarian control, and the denial of scientific evidence, the story of medieval hygiene laws serves as a warning about the dangers of allowing ideology to override basic human compassion and common sense. The courtiers who smiled and pretended not to notice the stench of their unwashed kings were complicit in a system that treated human beings as expendable resources in service of abstract principles. The next time you take a warm shower, brush your teeth, or put on clean clothes, remember the countless people who lived and died without these simple dignities because their rulers convinced them that cleanliness was evil and suffering was holy. Their stories deserve to be remembered not as curiosities from a distant past, but as warnings about the human capacity for self-deception and the terrible price of allowing power to define reality according to its own twisted needs.